I received one threat saying that a busload of people were coming for me, that they were demanding all of the free stuff that I had personally promised them.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Political. My name's Connor Allen, and I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Smith. Say hello, Ryan.
Hello, everyone.
And we have a very special episode for you here today. One of our key objectives in creating Political was to create a platform with which Americans, real ordinary Americans, can tell their stories. And so today we have a special guest. Her name is Laura. Hello, Laura.
Hello.
And Laura has an amazing story to tell. So we're going to jump right into it. But maybe, Laura, maybe you can just give us a bit of a personal introduction. What are your views politically? Where do you work? Do you support Trump or Biden? This sort of thing, a kind of general introduction.
So I work for the city of Seattle in the mayor's office, and I do a lot of the back-end non-policy work, a lot of coordination. But my political views are more of the progressive Democrat, which is a little harder with a big tent group party to fit neatly. But if I were in Europe, I would fall more center-left. However, in the US, I tend to fall a little bit on the farther left end of the scale. So I definitely do not support Trump. And I'll be voting for Biden.
Have you ever voted Republican?
Yes. I voted Republican once, and that was for a prosecuting attorney for my county. Because after having interned in the prosecuting attorney's office, I knew that the Democratic candidate was not qualified for the job and would have been a disaster in the role. So that would have been the one time I've actually voted for a Republican candidate.
A familiar story for our viewers, I suspect.
Don't tell anyone.
Yeah, so where do you live in the US?
I live in Seattle, which is in Washington State, right by Canada. So I definitely am on the West Coast, which has a more progressive leaning culture. Beautiful city.
Sorry, come on.
It's a beautiful city, but Seattle has a definite unique political culture, which has definitely colored my views. We are majority Democrat. But if you go to the east part of the state, you are in Trump land.
Okay. And these political divergences have had quite an impact on you recently, haven't you? Could you perhaps please tell us your story, the kind of reason you're here today?
So when I started working for the mayor, I knew I was working for someone who I didn't necessarily agree with 100%. But I definitely wanted to support Seattle, support progressive politics, and really give back to the community which raised me. And working for the mayor was a way to do that. However, I started in February, right when we were hit with the COVID pandemic. So that created a very interesting environment in which to learn my job and also see how everyone reacted in a crisis mode. And so that, created more stress in the population than I think we are normally used to. But then at the end of May, we were hit with a second crisis with the killing of George Floyd. And our BIPOC population began to protest the killing of George Floyd, as well as abuses at the hands of police and the need for police reform. And one of the unique circumstances is the Seattle Police Department is under what we call a consent decree. And that is oversight by the United States Justice Department about internal police reforms in terms of like abuses, use of force, but also crowd control and the measures that are taken in crowd control, which became incredibly apparent during the protests of George Floyd, where techniques used on the protesters when they started, or when certain factions started rioting and looting, became called into question as unconstitutional uses of force. And so after that, we had not only calls for reform, but after CHAZ and CHOP in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone and Occupied Protest, among other things in the Flashpoint with the East Precinct and use of tear gas, among other things, it became more of a protest against police brutality and defunding the police department. We started receiving an uptick of threats. Most originally were against the mayor, and a distinct uptick of hate mail, as well as a protest led by one of the more radical council members to the mayor's house after knowing that the mayor is under federal protection, because she was a former federal prosecutor and prosecuted organized crime and has legitimate death threats against her and her family. Brought the protesters to her house and publicly outed her address, which has been in an anonymity program. But after she did not resign and did not immediately heed to the demands of defunding 50%, among other things, they started going to staff members' houses. And that's also when Trump started to talk about Seattle a lot more. And once that started, all of the Trumpies began to email staff members and send death threats. I received one threat saying that a busload of people were coming for me, that they were demanding all of the free stuff that I had personally promised them. Among that was 12 abortions, apparently. It was a whole lot of crazy that I ended up Googling the guy to see if he was actually dumb enough to use his actual email, and he was. And it turns out that he was an addiction specialist in California who I believe is actually having a relapse at the moment. So I began wondering if I needed to call the police to see if he needed a welfare check. But clearly that was not, that threat, the more I dug into it, wasn't really viable, but there are others that other staff members have received where we've had to start formal investigations. And I know arrests have been made against certain individuals who have threatened staff and the mayor. And so that is the current culture which we are in, is this sort of bifurcated level of extremes.
Okay, when you say threats, are these threats, are they mostly emails, or were there sort of other forms? Like, what other kind of personal information did people get hold of about yourself?
So there's some staff emails are listed online, but given how much information is online, people have found out actually where folks have lived, but the mayor has actually had graffiti on her house that says "Die Bitch." There's been things like, Jenny should die, things like of that nature. And then there are cases that, because there's ongoing investigations, that we're not allowed to talk about. Other staff members have had their identities essentially cloned, where someone was starting to send threatening emails to a staffer and was making social media accounts in their name. Other people have gotten notes at their houses. Some city council members have actually gotten really threatening notes left in their mailboxes. But I usually get, the ones that I've received have been either emailed directly to me and my city email, or a lot have come semi-anonymously through, we have a web form for sending requests for meetings and things. We've gotten those that are done anonymously. So they will do, and there's been calls and hard copy mail sent in. So people will take whatever avenue they can find.
And when you receive these sorts of threats, and when you experience this kind of behavior against you, against your colleagues, against your boss for doing your jobs, how does it make you feel? I mean, do you feel safe in your own home? When you're walking down the street, are you looking over your shoulder? Like, how does it affect you?
No, I don't. I mean, I generally feel safe. I don't really look over my shoulder. I think having spent most of my career in public service, and having dealt with this on the federal level as well, I am not as bothered by it, and I'm more used to it than other colleagues who have not experienced this before. And I think that's a very strange thing to say now that I think about it. But sometimes, like, I actually worry about the people who are sending them, because there's sort of the 3 level of threats where you can tell someone may have just had a little too much to drink and thinks that they're doing something funny. Then you have the legitimately mentally ill folks who have conspiracy theories, but also don't have the capacity to really act on their threats. Like, you can tell by their emails that the thinking is just not ordered enough to be able to put a coherent plan together. And so you kind of discard those. And then you have the threats that are, I would say, very legitimate. And that's a minority of them. But I think there's a lot of folks who can't really tell the difference. So you have these sort of 3 levels and you can gauge them. So for me, I don't necessarily feel unsafe when you're getting a barrage of them. I think it's somewhat unsettling to feel like targeted, but there's some level of, when you do public service, this is something that you sign up for. Maybe not this amount, but understanding that there are going to be people who are unhappy with you and your views is something that you do have to deal with when you take a public role.
When you said, or when you talked about the way in which the police, the Seattle police, have responded to the protests, or when they've turned violent, and there's been looting and this kind of thing, and that kind of shocks me really, because at least from my perspective, the media portrayal has been that the Seattle police have mostly just appeased any of the protests that have turned violent, and that's kind of been the portrayal in both the left and right media as well. So do you feel like the mainstream media at least is giving an accurate portrayal of what is going on?
I think there's also a difference between the mainstream media that's local. I think local media has taken a more progressive stance, or sided with more of the progressive population, where I think national media has portrayed it. You know what? I think it really actually depends on the channel, in all honesty, the network, because I've seen it get reported to where it sounds like our protests are incredibly out of hand and the police are just sort of dealing with it the best they can. They're not the issue of it. And I've also seen reporting where it makes it sound like the police are actively targeting and are basically antagonizing the protesters who are somewhat violent. There's also 2 groups, which is interesting. So what would usually happen, especially with CHAZ and CHOP, in the East Precinct flashpoint is it would be peaceful during the day, and then a different group would generally come and it would deteriorate and tensions would rise, and then you would start seeing either tear gas or flashbangs being used, which would antagonize people more. And that's where, for us, a lot of the conflict arose, was with the use of crowd control tactics like flashbangs, CS gas, tear gas, pepper spray. And at one point, we agreed on a moratorium, the city and the police agreed on a moratorium against using tear gas, but had agreed to use other forms like pepper spray, which I don't think that was communicated well, as when the police at one point started using pepper spray, the city was accused of going back on not honoring their promise of a moratorium against some of the more aggressive crowd control tactics. But what was also not getting reported well was that the police were being thrown like iced water bottles, feces, and things at them. So it created a situation I think that was not beneficial for de-escalation on either side. But do I think the media has accurately portrayed it? Not entirely, on both ends.
You mentioned in that response these different factions that kind of come together to create the CHOP and the CHAZ and these. Who makes up these groups of people? Do they tend to be people from Seattle? Are they people who live in those communities, live in those neighborhoods?
Yes and no. It's a mix. A lot of the, I think we need to go back to around May 30th. So that group that started the destruction of downtown was primarily not from Seattle. However, the following protests were fairly organized by people who lived in outlying but connected communities. However, the leaders of those protests were fairly new to Seattle. They were not very integrated members of the community or like of the BIPOC or Black Lives Matter community, and were not associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. And then CHAZ and CHOP was a very organically grown movement that just sort of happened. And there was no actual organization or real leadership at all. And some of those folks were from Seattle. Some of those folks were from outlying areas. Some of those folks were not from the city at all. And some of those folks were actually homeless and taking advantage of the structure and the safety and the resources that CHAZ CHOP was providing. And some of these folks we've seen have come up from other places like Oregon or Eastern Washington.
So I have to ask you as well, in the CHOP zone, CHAZ zone, whatever you want to call it, did you get the impression, I don't know how often you ever sort of visited the area or how close by you were to the area, but did you get the impression that it was that particular protest was more peaceful, or do you think that was one of the areas that had turned more violent? So
CHAZ CHOP, I actually went to school in that area, and I used to live right near there when I was in university. But I live fairly close by. I did not go there because we're still having a lot of problems with COVID. And so I have been work from home and have trying not to leave as much as possible. But I have friends who live in that area, and I would talk to them on a daily basis. And as well as getting, we'd get daily situation reports. And during the day, and actually for most of the protest, CHAZ was peaceful. It was the East Precinct flashpoint that was actually violent. However, near the end, it became not the protest was violent, but there ended up being 3 shootings that happened in a series of 2 nights. And that's when things sort of began to unravel, and the city sort of decided that this really just needed to end. Because of the inability for first responders to provide adequate medical care or access to the victims. One was actually shot outside of the CHAZ zone, and then had been actually brought in and then had to be driven to the hospital in a private vehicle. I don't remember the exact location where the other person was shot. However, that one of them was definitely shot by someone who had intended to cause conflict, who had never been in the CHAZ zone and drove up and just started shooting. So the actual people who were part of the protest were primarily peaceful and were trying to deal with their conflict peacefully amongst themselves and doing a decent job of it. It was more outsiders coming in to cause problems who began to disrupt that protest and cause conflict.
Can you think of your city, and when we're talking about dead bodies in the street, when we're talking about shootings, when we're talking about people delivering to you threats of your job, and to your colleagues and to your boss, has it impacted your views? Has it changed the way you see America or politics in general?
Not directly. I think in some ways it's strengthened some of my views in terms of I am a very strong believer that the government, both federally and locally, has a responsibility to take care of its citizens and provide a basic level of support that I think a lot of people are not receiving. We have specifically in our state one of the, if not the most regressive tax structure in the United States. We do not have an income tax in Washington state. We only really do sales tax, and property taxes are our main form of revenue. And I think that has disproportionately pooled income, because generally with property taxes, it stays in certain communities. And it also has created a sort of dysregular, unpredictable funding stream. But it also disproportionately affects the lower levels of our society, the folks who don't, the lower level wage earners, who are primarily of color. And so you create this environment. So we have this regressive funding stream, and it's really pushed me into believing that we need to change our state's constitution to allow for an income tax to be able to more proportionally and fairly tax our residents and provide basic services that we are not providing. So that's where I sort of end up. But there are folks who believe that most of those services should be obtained on a personal level, and that's your own personal responsibility, and that's just not where I align.
Would you say the Democrats within Seattle or within Washington State as a whole, is there a push for them to introduce, I suppose what I would consider a more traditional type of tax revenue to income tax, or is there sort of no sight? Is there no future that you can see where that's going to happen anytime soon?
I think it's not going to happen anytime soon, in part because it's not an issue people find interesting. It's complicated. It requires a lot of attention and care to understand and research. And I just think that it's hard to present and talk to people about. I think that if you were to talk to people about lowering their property taxes and sort of completely restructuring, they would get on board. But because it's a state level issue and the eastern part of the state is so heavily Republican, which is more anti-tax, it would be a hard lift. But it's just also not an issue folks are used to talking about here, but also I think that the connections have not yet been made about our tax structure and our ability to provide social services and what that means in terms of our communities.
Oliver, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been really great to hear from someone who is on the front line of politics in Seattle, who is experiencing all these things firsthand. Because not just for us in Europe, but also for many people in the United States, they don't have firsthand experience of what's happening in Seattle. So it's really, really useful. Thank you very much. And I do wish you all the best in dealing with the numpties who think it's appropriate to be sending you those nasty emails. I also want to thank, as ever, the political viewers and audience. Please do remember to subscribe down below. It helps us create more content like this. And let us know in the comments if you have any questions for Laura or us, indeed. Till next time.